Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, and also, again, hello from my side. The topic is business models in the energy transition, as was just mentioned, and very top level, so very general to discuss it a little bit. And very quick background on myself, because I guess like some people might not know me. I studied physics in Regensburg in Germany, and did my thesis on the characterization of graphene from material annealing of epitaxial silicon carbide and silicon wafers. So it's a bit more in the material sciences and nanotechnology, so a bit of a different background. Then I switched over to do a master's in sustainable energy competence. I was studying competence, so a very broad master's, a bit of other different renewable energy technologies. We also did projects on floating hydropower turbines and wind power turbines and micro hydropower. Before I did my thesis, or started my thesis with the Universidad de Ovideo as a collaboration on the role of aggregators in the energy transition. And that's where I'm also currently at. I'm doing my PhD in energy and process control on flexibility management of distributed energy resources. And some of the publications from this year, where the main one was also on the role of aggregators in the energy transition, also like I guess somewhat related to the business models, I guess. So actually starting now with the business models, I want to give like a fair, broad overview on the business model development basics, and want to use the business model canvas for that, which was published by Osterwalder and Pigma. So most of the references I'm referring to, they're always like mentioned somewhere on the slide. Where in one of the main parts of a business model would be the value proposition. That includes a selected area of like advantageous products for a specific customer segment. Also included is some infrastructure that the business model has to involve. That includes key partners who are the businesses interacting with, the key activities. Is it rather producing something? Is it problem solving or some type of platform or network? And also key resources. They can be either physical, like actual assets, generation units, or also intellectual, human resources, or financial resources. Then part of the business model also has the customer interface. So is there any direct customer relationship, personal assistance, or is it some automated service? The different channels, the communication mediums with the customers, and also the actual customer segment, who's addressed. Is it the mass market? Is it a niche market? And the last part, which is the business model, has to be based on some type of revenue model. So you have a cost structure with either fixed costs or variable costs, and also different revenue streams that can be either one-time client payments or recurring payments as well. And that business model canvas just helps on like assessing businesses a little bit from a different level, or having like the idea clear of what a business is like, and how it also maybe changes over time. And this is the actual layout of the business model canvas, how it's formed. And I want to go through it, like where the center part is the value proposition, the financial streams that we've seen. And this I want to do an example for an energy supplier. So the traditional energy supplier, that would be an energy supplier that actually has large conventional power plants. So the value proposition would be the reliable supply of energy, typically with per unit billing, and the quality given to certain regulation. Then the key activities would be the construction operation of those large-scale power plants, normally relying on economies of scale, and including the generation and sale of electricity. The key resources would then be those are physical assets, so big centralized power plants typically, and maybe also some specialized know-how depending on the assets, like for example for nuclear. And key partners would mainly be the grid operators. On the customer side, they have rather low efforts for the acquisition of customers, because typically in the traditional network, let's say, you have like a monopolistic structure of suppliers, and they are approached typically by the customer. So the efforts on the customer segments are rather low. And this is also addressing the mass market, but also obviously industry, trade and commerce. The cost structures include primarily the generation cost, and including also staff, assets and so forth. And then the revenue streams would be from recurring payments through the sale of electricity. There are 4 key segments of this canvas for business models, and a business model can be driven by one of these segments. So on the example of the energy supplier, that would be a rather resource-driven business model, because the assets, the resources actually determine the rest of the business model. So the value, yeah. So With a resource-driven business model, that also is based on mainly the resources that the business model have. The influences then also the costs and the revenue streams, the customers that are approached through this, and also what value is proposed. In a rather customer-driven business model, the business model rather reacts a lot more, or is formed around what the customer needs are. Like any type of service is a lot more focused on what the customers want. So also the offering is adapted to whatever the customer wants, and it's a lot more personalized. In a finance-driven business model, that could be something, it's basically more based on financial solutions. That could be something like leasing, for example, of different products. So like the main idea of that business is like providing some way or like different payment methods for whatever product you do. So it's driven by the different payments model that it has. And then it can also be offer driven, like a very random example, like an adventure company. So like the adventure is like the main offer they do. And then depending on which customer segment you want to address, which resources you might require, and also what costs are involved. So this is just also a way of thinking about the main focus of those business models that can be created. And quite important, I guess, also increasingly is not only the economic perspective of the business models, but also environmental life cycle. So you could do the same type of assessment of the business according to actual environmental impacts or benefits. What's the use phase of maybe a product, what materials are used within the business, which is also interesting to assess, and even more so now with the different targets that are set on sustainability. And the same or alike would be the idea of social stakeholders. So what social impacts or benefits might a certain business actually bring? What's the societal culture within the company as well? So those are like just different ways also to assess maybe a business idea or business model. Now I'm actually going to get into some of the key trends of some of the business models and also requirement of business models in the energy transition. And I'm discussing this again on the example of an energy supplier, for instance. So there's a trend mainly from resource-driven business models over to rather customer-driven business models, which is for once related to the different goals: decarbonization, so more renewable energies; decentralization, so there are a lot more small generation assets like distributed energy resources like rooftop PV panels and so forth. So there is actually more service involved in maybe using also flexibility of different assets. So this is like one of the key trends. And in the specific example, so of the energy supply, instead of selling energy volumes through large-scale conventional power plants and economies of scale, like upscaling, the more you produce, the more you can sell and the more money you make, goes over to a rather like energy service business. So how can you maybe do battery management, or how can you use the demand side flexibility to maybe create customer savings? So it's like rather services that are put to the focus there. Then there's also an example of like innovative contracting, which can include like the storage cloud for like a battery, or for the PV actually, PV production, PV leasing or contracting, and some others like that. Then also from looking at the distribution channels again, there, like before, there were rather low efforts as mentioned, because like the suppliers would be approached maybe by the customers, and since there was rather little competition, there was not a lot of effort in that. Changing over to a more proactive customer role, if they have their own, first of all, their own resources and a lot more choice of providers and tariffs, there's more competition. And there's also increasing importance then of actually winning buying customers through a more consumer-centric offering. Another trend would be the change of the actual which is related to the degree of the integration of the business. So before it was rather vertically integrated, so the company actually does it all and can offer it everything. So there's a fairly low dependency on other key partners. Now the actual management of the different distributed assets that are all over the place, you need communication, also information and communication technologies, Then you have a lot of different providers, so they have different ways of controlling maybe batteries and so forth. So it's a lot more complex, and that requires, for once, like essential corporations to unlock some of the flexibility maybe of different assets, and also some form of information sharing between all the different stakeholders involved. So there's an increasing importance of key partners as well in those like business models. And another part, which is, I guess, rather like the ideal thought, instead of like only maximizing energy unit sales for company profits, it should go over to like a rather holistic maximization of benefits for not only maybe suppliers, but also the customers through cost savings. In some way, the distribution system operators have to be involved in like society as a general, as an overall idea. And we can look again at the same business model for the idea of an energy supplier 2.0. That would be the one that is already a lot more proactive and involved with different customers. That could involve a value proposition of like additional value through pooling, aggregation of different assets of distributed energy resources, and maybe some improved procurement strategies or portfolio management. Then the key activities might include rather some efficient algorithms for some economically efficient schedules for batteries, for instance. That's, I guess, what a lot of people might also work on how to actually do like efficient management of different like assets. Then key resources may be rather a platform or algorithms, so it's maybe not as tangible as like the physical assets. Key partners are also a lot more diverse, also including now in some way maybe households with flexible assets, some other local green installers, because you need actually people with the knowledge of like installations and so forth. So there's a lot more interaction involved. Customer relationships are a lot more direct, because now if you want to offer a specific service, and there's a lot of different ways of approaching customers with different preferences as well, this is something that needs to be taken into account. And the cost structures then would also change if there's a platform towards like maybe platform management and other processes involved in that, and then revenue streams probably from some portfolio optimization or other like management of flexibility, for instance. So some of the key requirements for those ideas or business models would definitely be smart meter gateways. Then there's need for data connection, also standardized data connection, because it's actually quite complex, especially with all the communication that you need to do with like thousands of assets. Normally, like the first ideas or models are always done on like 3 different assets or something, 3 different households, but in the end, this is supposed to work for several hundreds and thousands of households. So there needs to be some standardization as well, and data availability. Then especially also a political discourse and a framework for actual like customer rights in that, and the data rights in that. Lower market or regulatory barriers, especially for the aggregated flexibility, which I'm going to skip here for now. And also promotion of energy efficiency particularly. And maybe just quickly skipping through, I think this I'm gonna just go over so we have more time to maybe discuss a little bit more and not to make it too long. So maybe just the main comparison for the traditional distribution network. This is a bit focused on the distribution network. Like the distribution system operator would have the main, it's a regulated business, regulated revenue streams and how the business is organized. But the main function would be the distribution of electricity to the households, the maintenance, and then also the expansion of the grid. And continuing with that, as mentioned, they would have country-specific usage tariffs. And in the rather new role is a question of how, with those different new resources that are available, how could that change maybe to the role of a rather active system manager? I mean, it's similar for the other stakeholders, which I'm not going to discuss now in detail because that we can discuss in a different way. But just specifically maybe now for the distribution system operator business model, which as mentioned is regulated, is actually quite difficult to see, or also to think on how should the business change if it's regulated, for example, for the incomes. How would they actually change maybe their the goal of efficiency in using the grid in a different way if they don't know who, like, what are the responsibilities, like who would be responsible if maybe the operation that should guarantee that an overload wouldn't happen because they didn't do an upgrade of the capacity, like how is that accounted for? So there are quite a lot of questions involved with that. And that's on aggregators. I'm going to skip through now too, I think. Is that something, if you want to discuss, we can go through, but that's just an example of some now aggregator. So aggregator, I haven't got given the definition, but basically a flexibility manager with like, you can have different roles and responsibilities. Just a major trend that would be here is still, that's for the European market and just like an incomplete review. But most of the services or like business models still based on also rather major customers. So it's not still at the very low level for residential households. It's still rather on a central, I guess, level where it is easier to do all the communications management of different assets and also the availability of larger scale resources. And this I'm also going to skip through. That's like some interactions to come back to the last or the first view again of the business model canvas that I think would be interesting to discuss some of the interactions or changes, especially for the key partners. Knowing also, I guess, with the main the key activities. So like who's taking care of what, who's the like what responsibility would each stakeholder take, and how could that also be regulated depending on who they interact with, and who would be responsible for example, an imbalance. Like that's like one of the I guess key questions a lot of times. And how is that also reflected again in like different cost structures or revenue streams? And then just one quick cartoon, talking a lot about business models is still like I guess the main ideas to make those ideas work, because there are a lot of good business models, but in Earth, no business model can survive without it. And that's already the last bit, and I just put a few questions, and again, like the interaction. So if you want to discuss on something, make a comment, or have some critical thoughts, then that's it already.